Imagine opening your door to find a wolf, bloodied and desperate, scratching at your door for help. You think it's just seeking shelter, but what happens next will shock you. Eli thought he was saving this wolf from the cold, but in truth, a deadly predator was hunting them both. A bond forged under threat, a battle for survival, and a sacrifice that will change everything. Get ready for an unforgettable story of survival, loyalty, and courage. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the chill of the mountain peaks deep into the valley. Eli, nestled in the solitude of his cabin on the outskirts of Wyoming's Teton Range, had become used to the isolation. The days were long, the nights colder. The rhythmic sound of the storm outside had become his constant companion. He had come here for the quiet, for the distance from everything, a place where he could think, write, and forget about the noise of the world. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long, blood-orange shadows across the snow, Eli sat by the fire. His hand absently ran across the pages of his notebook, words flowing as he attempted to piece together the next chapter of his novel. Outside, the world was slowly being swallowed by the night, the snow-covered landscape stretching out in every direction as far as the eye could see. The isolation was both peaceful and unnerving. Then it came, a soft scratching at the door. Eli froze. The wind outside was strong enough to make the trees creak and sway, but there was something about the sound at his door that was too deliberate, too insistent. His hand went still over his notebook, and he listened harder. Another scratch, then a low whimper, barely audible, but enough to stir something deep inside him. "Who's there?" Eli muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. He stood slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. He wasn't expecting anyone, not out here in the wilderness, where the nearest neighbor was miles away. With a steadying breath, he walked toward the door. When Eli opened it, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. There, standing in the snow, at the edge of the porch, was a wolf. A gray wolf, its fur matted with wet snow and blood, its body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Its piercing yellow eyes locked onto his, wide with fear. The wolf's breaths were shallow, each exhale visible in the crisp air, but it didn't move, didn't flee. It was as if it had been waiting for him to appear. Eli stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Wolves weren't uncommon in these parts, but they were wild, elusive. And this wolf wasn't just any animal. There was something haunting about it. Its gaze seemed to plead, like it was begging for help. "Hey there, boy," Eli murmured, stepping back from the door. "You look hurt." The wolf took a step forward, its legs shaky, but it did not hesitate. It moved slowly, as if trusting him. Despite its condition, it wasn't aggressive. There was no snarling, no growling, just a quiet desperation. The wolf stopped right at Eli's feet, its tail low but still wagging faintly, as if in recognition. Eli's heart raced as he looked down at the injured animal. His mind screamed at him to close the door, to lock it, and to stay inside where it was safe. But something in the wolf's eyes, the deep, almost human-like sadness, compelled him to act. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be alone. Maybe it was because the creature in front of him seemed so far from the savage hunter wolves were known to be. Without another thought, Eli crouched down. He carefully reached out and placed a hand on the wolf's shoulder, feeling the warmth of its body against the cold night. The wolf winced, but didn't pull away. "Come inside," Eli whispered, his voice shaky as he gently pulled the wolf into the cabin. He closed the door behind them, locking out the night's chill. Inside, the fire crackled, its light dancing off the walls. Eli quickly grabbed a blanket from his bed and draped it over the wolf, who collapsed gratefully onto the floor by the hearth. The wolf's breathing was heavy now, labored from its injuries, and it was clear it had been through hell. Blood stained its fur and its paws were torn, as though it had been running for miles. Eli fetched his first aid kit and kneeled beside the animal. As he cleaned its wounds, he felt a shiver crawl down his spine. There was something unsettling about this wolf's presence. It wasn't just the way it had appeared on his doorstep. It wasn't just the look of pure exhaustion in its eyes. It was the feeling that something more was at play. The wolf, Kai, as Eli would soon come to call him, had come here for a reason. But what exactly had chased it to this doorstep? And why had it chosen Eli's cabin of all places? As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Eli finished tending to the wolf's wounds. Kai's eyes fluttered, then closed, but not before he looked up at Eli one last time, thankful, trusting, and afraid. Eli sat back against the wall, watching the wolf carefully. His mind raced with questions, but before he could settle on any answers, he heard it. A low, distant howl carried on the wind. It was close. Too close. The wolf's ears perked up, and it let out a quiet growl. Eli felt his heartbeat quicken. Something was out there. The days that followed were filled with strange quietness. Eli awoke every morning to find Kai lying by the hearth, still weak but slowly recovering. The wolf's breathing was no longer labored, and the blood on its fur had dried. Kai's presence had become a fixture in the cabin, an odd comfort amidst the stillness of the mountains. Eli had never imagined that a wolf, let alone one that had appeared on his doorstep in such a desperate state, could become part of his life in this way. But there was something undeniably powerful about the bond between them. Kai had come to him in his most vulnerable moment, and Eli couldn't ignore the deep sense of gratitude he felt for the animal. He had no idea how or why Kai had ended up at his door, but every instinct inside him told him to keep him safe. By the third day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that covered everything in sight. The air was still, crisp, and clear. Too clear. The silence outside felt heavier than it should. Eli spent most of his time working by the fire, repairing his tools, or reading old books to pass the time. Kai, though, had taken a new interest in the outside world. Whenever Eli wasn't looking, the wolf would pace the small cabin, his ears flicking at every sound, his eyes darting toward the windows. He seemed restless, almost on edge. At night, Kai would sit by the door, staring out into the blackness of the wilderness, as if waiting for something. Eli couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The wolf was not just reacting to the sounds of the wind or the occasional crack of ice. There was something more, something primal, something that Kai was sensing long before Eli could. Then, one evening, it happened again. A howl, a mournful cry echoed through the mountains, a sound that sent a chill down Eli's spine. It wasn't the sound of a single wolf. No, this was the sound of a pack. The howls bounced off the mountainsides, reverberating through the trees, a deep, resonating warning. Kai's reaction was immediate. He stood up, his body tense, his fur bristling. His growl was low at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as he stepped toward the door, his tail raised in defense. His yellow eyes locked onto Eli, and for the first time since he had arrived, the wolf looked truly afraid. Eli hesitated. He wanted to reach out, to calm the animal, but he knew that Kai wasn't afraid of the storm, nor was he scared of anything in the cabin. It wasn't the wind that had put him on edge. It was something else, something out there, in the dark. The howling continued, coming closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy paws crunching in the snow. The pack was near. Very near. Eli's heart raced, and he instinctively moved to the window. His breath fogged up the glass as he pressed his face to it, straining his eyes to see anything in the dim light. The trees in the distance were still, the wind calm, but in the farthest reach of the forest, he saw movement. Dark shapes, sliding between the shadows of the snow-covered trees. There were more wolves. They were out there, circling his cabin. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. The pack wasn't just out hunting, they were hunting Kai. A cold sweat broke out on Eli's brow. He had no idea how many wolves were out there, but the sheer size of the shadows moving in the forest told him it wasn't a small pack. This wasn't some random predator. This was an organized group of creatures led by something or someone powerful. Kai's growl grew louder, more urgent, as if he could sense the danger approaching. Eli backed away from the window, his thoughts racing. He'd heard stories of wild wolf packs in these parts, stories of alpha wolves that would do anything to protect their territory. But this pack wasn't just protecting their land. They were hunting Kai. The door rattled slightly as the wind picked up again, the howl of the wolves growing louder and more intense. I'm not letting you get hurt, Eli whispered to Kai, more to himself than the wolf. We need to stay inside just for tonight. It'll pass. But Kai wasn't listening. The wolf stood at the door, his body coiled and ready to spring into action. He wasn't about to wait for the pack to come to him. Eli's mind raced. He couldn't let Kai face the wolves alone, but he wasn't equipped to fight off a pack. He had only a few guns for hunting, nothing heavy enough to deter a pack of wolves. His cabin wasn't a fortress. If those wolves were determined to get inside, they would. Then came the scratching again, not at the door, but on the windows. Faint, but unmistakable, like claws dragging against the glass. A chill ran through Eli's body. The wolves weren't just circling, they were testing the cabin. Kai's growl deepened, vibrating through the walls of the cabin. He was more than just an animal. He was a protector. Eli had no idea how he knew that, but it was clear now. This wolf wasn't just trying to survive, he was trying to save Eli too. The realization hit Eli like a wave of clarity. Whatever was coming, he wasn't going to face it alone. The night fell heavier, darker, as the wind whipped around the cabin, carrying the echoes of the wolves' howls like an ominous drumbeat. Eli could feel the tension in the air thickening with every passing moment. He had to do something, anything, to protect himself and Kai. But what? The wolves were out there, their presence unmistakable. Eli had grown up in the wild, and while he was no stranger to nature's dangers, this was different. The sheer coordination of the pack was unlike anything he'd seen before. These wolves weren't just hunting for food, they were hunting for revenge, and Kai was their target. Eli turned to the wolf, whose gaze had never left the door. Kai's muscles were taut, his body brimming with anticipation, as if he were preparing for a fight he had no choice but to face. His ears flicked with every noise outside, his growl soft, but persistent. It was as though he could hear things Eli could not, his instincts honed far sharper than any human could understand. Eli's heart beat harder in his chest, and his mind raced. He wasn't going to let the wolves take Kai without a fight. This wasn't just some wild animal. Kai had trusted him. The wolf had come to his door, seeking refuge, seeking a protector, and that's what Eli was going to be. But he couldn't do it alone. The howl of the pack pierced the silence again, this time much closer. It was a spine-chilling sound, a call to arms. The wolves were closing in on the cabin, their paws crunching softly in the fresh snow. He could hear them moving in the distance, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eli grabbed his rifle from the corner of the room, a rusty old piece he'd inherited from his father. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His fingers shook as he checked the ammo, loading it carefully. The pack was large, at least 5 or 6 wolves, maybe more. He couldn't afford to miss. Kai's eyes locked onto him, his expression unreadable. Eli knew the wolf didn't need his protection. He was a creature born for survival. But something inside Eli told him that they were in this together, for better or worse. A sharp scratching sound interrupted his thoughts, coming from the wooden walls now. The wolves were testing the strength of the cabin, trying to find a weak spot. Eli could almost feel the pressure building with every claw that scraped against the wood. They wouldn't stop. They would keep pushing until they found a way in. Kai's growl turned into a snarl, a warning for Eli to stay back. The wolf slowly circled the cabin's small living area, his body low, ready to pounce. His eyes never strayed from the door, from the shadows outside, where the wolves were waiting. Eli watched, unsure of what to do. The animal in front of him was a force of nature, its movements swift and calculated. Kai wasn't afraid of what was coming. He was waiting for it, ready to defend his territory. Then, just as Eli stepped toward the door, the pack struck. With a terrifying crash, the front door exploded inward. Wood splintered as the largest wolf, an enormous hulking creature with thick dark fur, broke through, his eyes wild with hunger. Behind him, the rest of the pack followed, moving with swift precision, their eyes gleaming in the dim light of the cabin. Eli fired, the rifle kicking back in his hands. The shot rang out, deafening in the small cabin. But the wolf wasn't fazed. He barely flinched. The bullet had grazed his side, but that was all. The pack advanced, moving with lethal intent. Kai lunged forward, his teeth bared, his snarls deafening. He collided with the largest wolf, sending them both crashing into the wall. The force of the impact shook the cabin, but Kai didn't stop. He twisted, biting, tearing at the enemy's throat with a ferocity that left Eli breathless. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The cabin was filled with chaos, howls, growls, the pounding of claws on wood, and the fierce clash of teeth against flesh. Eli stood frozen, rifle still in hand, as Kai and the pack fought with an intensity that he couldn't fully comprehend. The smaller wolves moved quickly, darting in and out, trying to flank Kai. Eli fired again, his aim steadier this time, hitting one of the wolves in the shoulder. The creature yelped, stumbling back, but the others pressed forward. Eli's heart raced as the weight of the situation settled in. There were too many of them, and Kai, though strong and agile, was still wounded. Eli had no illusions. If the pack overpowered him, Kai would be torn apart. "Kai!" Eli shouted, desperate to draw the wolf's attention. "Get back!" Kai, already bloodied but relentless, glanced toward Eli. His yellow eyes burned with an animalistic focus. The wolf knew what needed to be done. He wasn't going to let the pack take him down without a fight. In that moment, the full force of the pack bore down on Kai. Eli's instincts took over as he ran forward, pulling the rifle up to aim once more. The largest wolf turned toward him, eyes glowing with malice, but Kai was there, fighting tooth and claw, forcing the beast back. The fight was brutal. The air was thick with the scent of blood and the sound of growls. But Eli knew he couldn't hesitate. He aimed carefully, steadying his breath, and fired. The shot rang out, striking the alpha wolf square in the chest. He collapsed to the floor with a howl, his body crumpling in a heap. For a heartbeat, the pack stopped, confused and disoriented. The other wolves hesitated, eyes shifting from their fallen leader to Kai, who was panting heavily, covered in his own blood. The pack was momentarily stunned, but the silence didn't last. The remaining wolves quickly regrouped, snarling and circling the cabin once more. Eli's pulse raced. They weren't done yet. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. The howls of the remaining wolves outside reverberated through the walls, growing louder with every passing second. Kai's chest heaved as he stood over the body of the fallen alpha, his bloodied fur matted against the cold floor. He didn't move. His eyes were locked on the door, ears twitching as he listened to the wolves still outside, their growls laced with rage. Eli's hand trembled as he lowered the rifle. The shot had taken down their leader, but it hadn't scared the pack off. They were still out there, circling, waiting for their moment to strike. And now they knew that the cabin wasn't as invincible as they had once believed. With the alpha gone, the pack was scattered, but far from defeated. Eli could see the wolves in his mind's eye. Eyes glinting in the darkness, their paws moving like shadows in the snow. They were testing him, trying to force him into a corner, and soon they would strike. He glanced at Kai. The wolf was injured, but still standing tall. The blood from his side had soaked through his fur, but his posture was proud, defiant. He wasn't going down without a fight. Eli moved quickly, pulling the heavy wooden barricade that he had been preparing earlier in front of the door. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might buy them some time. He could hear the wolves just beyond the door, scratching at the wood, pawing at the frame with desperate hunger. They were trying to get inside, clawing at their prey, driven by the same ruthless instinct that had led them here. Kai stood at Eli's side, his eyes shifting from the door to Eli's face, watching him intently. The wolf's breathing was shallow, his body tensed for action, but there was something else in those eyes, something deeper. It was a look Eli hadn't seen before, not from a wild animal. It was almost trust. Eli reached out and placed a hand on Kai's shoulder, feeling the warmth of the wolf's body against the cold of the cabin. "We're in this together," Eli whispered. "I'm not leaving you." The words felt like a promise, but as the howls outside grew louder, Eli knew that promises didn't always mean survival. The wolves would break through soon. There was no doubt about it. The pack was too determined, too smart. The barricade wouldn't hold forever. Then came the sound that Eli feared most, the unmistakable crack of wood splintering. It wasn't the door, not yet, but the wall beside it. One of the wolves had found a weak spot. Eli's heart skipped a beat. The wolves were getting desperate. They were closing in. Kai's growl rumbled in the back of his throat, a low, deep warning. Eli moved toward the rifle, checking it once more, then turning back to the door. He could hear them now, their claws scraping against the cabin's frame, their breath ragged with hunger and anticipation. The barricade groaned again as another wolf pressed against it, testing its strength. It wasn't going to last much longer. Eli's pulse quickened. "Get back," he whispered to Kai, but the wolf didn't move. He stayed right by Eli's side, his body low to the ground, his eyes never leaving the door. Then, as if on cue, the door slammed open. The force of it knocked the barricade off its hinges. Two wolves burst through the opening, their eyes glowing with fury. They lunged at Eli with teeth bared, but Kai was faster. With a powerful leap, the wolf hurled himself at the first attacker, knocking it sideways with the force of his body. The second wolf rushed forward, its jaws snapping at Kai's throat. "No!" Eli shouted. He fired the rifle again, hitting the second wolf square in the side. It yelped, stumbling backward, but Kai wasn't waiting for it to recover. With a snarl, he lunged at the wounded wolf, his fangs sinking into its neck with a deadly precision. The wolf let out a strangled cry before it fell limp at Kai's paws. But there was no time to celebrate. Another wolf, larger and faster than the others, rushed in, its teeth flashing. It was the Alpha's second in command, and it was even more vicious than its predecessor. Eli fired once more, but the bullet missed. The wolf was too quick. It snapped at Kai, catching the wolf's side with its sharp teeth. Kai howled in pain, but didn't retreat. He fought harder, his teeth sinking into the side of the second in command's neck, his claws ripping into its side. The fight was brutal, and Eli couldn't keep up. He fired again, this time grazing the wolf's leg, but it wasn't enough to stop the onslaught. Eli ran to the side, grabbing a heavy log from the pile he had prepared for the fire. With all his strength, he swung it at the wolf, connecting with its skull. The wolf yelped in surprise, stumbling back just enough for Kai to get a solid grip on its throat. In that moment, with a final savage twist, Kai tore through the wolf's windpipe, bringing the creature to the ground. Panting heavily, Kai stepped back, his chest heaving, his body shaking with exhaustion and blood loss. The remaining wolves had retreated into the dark, no longer willing to face the pair of them. Eli stood, his breath coming in ragged gasps, surveying the aftermath. The cabin was a mess. Wood splintered everywhere, blood pooling on the floor. The wolves were gone, but it was clear they wouldn't be the last. Eli looked at Kai, his heart racing. The wolf was still standing, but just barely. His fur was soaked with blood, his body covered in scratches and bites. He was hurt, badly. "Stay with me, buddy," Eli whispered, kneeling beside Kai, his hand resting gently on the wolf's side. "We've made it through worse, right?" Kai's eyes flickered up to meet his, the wolf's chest rising and falling with every breath. For a moment, Eli thought he might lose him, but then Kai's tail gave a faint thump against the floor. It was a small thing, but it was enough. It was a sign. They had made it through the worst, but the fight wasn't over. The pack might have retreated for now, but the wilderness was unforgiving, and Eli knew that this was just the beginning. As the night stretched on, Eli and Kai sat together by the fire, the world outside still filled with the echoes of the wolves' cries. But inside, in the warmth of the cabin, they were safe. For now. The sun had long disappeared behind the mountains, and the cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a fragile shell against the storm that was brewing outside. Eli sat by the fire, his eyes never leaving Kai, who lay on the floor, his breathing steady but labored. The wolf had stopped moving, his body still, almost too still. Blood soaked into the floor around him, and Eli's heart twisted with every shallow exhale the wolf took. Eli had done what he could to patch up Kai's wounds with the meager supplies he had left, but nothing could disguise the fact that Kai was fading. The wolf was strong, there was no doubt about that, but even the fiercest creatures had their limits. And Eli knew that the longer Kai lay there, the worse it would get. The wind howled outside, the snow still piling up around the cabin, cutting them off from the rest of the world. Eli had always known that the wilderness could be brutal, but he had never expected this. A battle for his life and for Kai's. And yet, there was something else, something that gnawed at him as he watched the wolf fight for every breath. It wasn't just the physical toll of the battle with the pack that had taken its toll. No, something more profound was at play, something that went beyond the simple fight for survival. Kai had trusted him. A wild animal, a creature of instinct and self-reliance, had come to him for help. And Eli had given it shelter, protection, even his heart. But in return, Kai had become more than just a wolf to him. He had become a companion, a friend, a protector. Eli's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden, eerie sound of a howl, distant but unmistakable. A single mournful cry that seemed to echo from the depths of the forest. The pack was still out there, waiting. But it wasn't just the pack that worried Eli now. Something else had changed. The quiet urgency that had gripped the night, that primal sense of danger, had shifted into something darker, something deeper. The fire crackled, sending a burst of warmth into the room, but Eli felt cold. His hand shook as he reached for his rifle again, though his fingers ached from the strain of holding it earlier. The threat outside was still present, but there was something more, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. Eli froze, his heart skipping a beat. No one had come out here in days, not since the pack first appeared. It was too late for a visitor, too late for help. And yet, the knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of scraping claws against wood. It was no wolf, it was something else. Eli stood up, his heart hammering in his chest. Kai stirred, his head lifting weakly, eyes flickering toward the door. Despite his injuries, the wolf's instincts kicked in, his body tense, alert. Something was wrong. With every ounce of caution, Eli stepped toward the door. His hand hovered over the handle, his mind racing. He had to know who or what was on the other side. The thought of opening the door filled him with dread, but it was a dread that had been building for days, a dread that had been waiting for this exact moment. He slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness and the heavy snow falling in thick curtains. The silence outside was suffocating, the storm having swallowed the night whole. But then the air shifted. Eli felt it, a presence behind him, something large, something unseen. He spun around, his rifle raised, his heart racing. But before he could react, a shadow loomed in the doorway. It was a person. The figure stepped into the cabin, their face obscured by the hood of their heavy coat. Snow clung to their clothing, their boots caked with ice. Eli's mind raced as he took in the stranger's presence. Who was this person? How had they gotten here? I didn't even mean to startle you. The figure's voice was low, gruff. But you're in danger, and you're not alone. Eli's stomach dropped. He had heard that voice before. It wasn't a voice of a traveler lost in the storm or a passing hunter looking for shelter. This was something different. This voice was too familiar, too knowing. You! Eli's breath caught in his throat. How did you find us? The figure pulled back the hood, revealing a face that Eli hadn't seen in years, one he had hoped never to see again. Graham? Eli's voice trembled. What are you doing here? The man in front of him was older, his face weathered and worn by time, but the eyes were the same. The eyes that had once been a reflection of his own. Graham had been his brother-in-law, married to his late sister, Sarah. They had been close once, sharing everything from the quiet solitude of the woods to the everyday struggles of life. But something had changed in the years since Eli had last seen him, something dark. Graham's lips curled into a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I've been following you, Eli, he said, his voice cold. I knew you'd come back here. I knew it would only be a matter of time before you made the mistake of trying to survive with the wolf. Eli's heart sank. What do you mean? His mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning behind Graham's words. What are you talking about? Graham stepped forward, eyes flicking to Kai, who had risen to his feet, a low growl vibrating through his chest. The wolf's posture was threatening, but Graham didn't flinch. That wolf isn't what you think it is, Graham continued, his tone darkening. It's not just a wild animal. It's more. It's part of something bigger, something dangerous. And you've just walked into the middle of it. Eli's mind reeled. He had been so focused on surviving, on protecting Kai, that he had never considered the possibility that there was something else at play. But Graham's words rang with a chilling certainty. Something wasn't right. The storm outside had grown even fiercer, the snow swirling in thick, angry gusts, turning the world outside into an impenetrable white void. The cabin was bathed in the dim light of the flickering fire, casting long shadows across the room. Eli stood still, his mind reeling from the revelation Graham had dropped on him. The truth had come crashing down, and with it, a deeper, darker danger than he had ever anticipated. Graham's words echoed in his ears, growing louder with every passing second. It's not just a wild animal, it's part of something bigger. But what did that even mean? And why was Graham here, in the middle of nowhere, after all these years? Kai stood beside Eli, still weak from the battle with the pack. His fur was matted with blood, and he had barely managed to stay on his feet, but there was a fire in his eyes. A will to survive that was undeniable. He was more than just a wolf now. He was Eli's protector, his ally, and in that moment, Eli would do whatever it took to keep him safe. "Graham, what the hell are you talking about?" Eli demanded, his voice strained with disbelief. "What's bigger than a wolf pack?" Graham didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. "You've been living a lie, Eli," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This wolf, it's not just some stray you found in the woods. It's part of something ancient, something that goes back long before either of us were born." Eli's chest tightened, his mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of Graham's words. "What do you mean, something ancient?" he asked, the unease creeping up his spine. "What the hell is going on here?" Graham let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You really don't know, do you? You've been living here, in this isolation, thinking you're just another man in the wild. But you're not. Neither is this wolf." He pointed to Kai, who growled low in his throat. "That animal is the key to everything. The wolves, they've been following him for a reason. And you, Eli, you've become part of that reason." Eli's blood ran cold. "You're saying that this is all connected? That Kai and I are somehow part of this?" Graham nodded slowly, his face grim. "You don't understand. The wolves are not just hunting for food. They're part of an ancient order, a pack that's been following this bloodline for generations. And now, they found you. You're in the middle of something you can't even begin to comprehend." A shiver ran down Eli's spine. His whole world had shifted. Everything he thought he knew suddenly thrown into chaos. An ancient order? He couldn't make sense of it. But there was one thing he was sure of. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. A sudden crash from outside the cabin shattered the silence, followed by a chorus of howls. Eli's heart leaped into his throat. The pack was coming. The door slammed open with terrifying force, the wood splintering under the pressure. Several wolves lunged into the cabin, their eyes glowing with hunger and rage. But it wasn't just any wolves. These were different, bigger, stronger, their movements more calculated and coordinated. Eli's hand shot to the rifle, but before he could react, Kai was already in motion, his body springing forward with the speed and precision of a predator. The wolf's teeth snapped shut on the throat of the first wolf to charge, and with a single powerful twist, he tore it down. Eli fired, his bullet hitting one of the wolves square in the chest, but there were too many. They kept coming, one after another, driven by the same primal instinct. Graham stood still, watching with a detached gaze. "You still don't understand," he muttered under his breath. "This is what they want. They need the wolf to lead them. They're not just hunting for food, they're hunting for power." "What the hell are you talking about?" Eli shouted, his frustration boiling over as he grabbed the rifle again, firing at another wolf. "The pack is looking for something more than survival," Graham explained, stepping back toward the door as another wave of wolves poured into the room. "They need the alpha, and the only one who can stop them is you." Eli's mind was racing. "Me?" But before he could process the meaning of Graham's words, the wolves were upon them. Kai fought valiantly, his body moving with an almost unnatural grace as he tore through the pack. But even he couldn't keep up with the sheer number of wolves. Blood stained the floor, the air thick with the scent of fear and desperation. Eli grabbed a large piece of wood from the fire and swung it at the nearest wolf, knocking it back. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought to protect Kai, who was weakening, his movements becoming slower as the battle wore on. One wolf, larger than the rest, moved toward him, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. It was the leader of the pack, the one who had been calling the shots from the shadows. Eli raised his rifle, but it was too late. The wolf lunged, its jaws snapping shut, just inches from Eli's face. Suddenly, there was a blur of motion. Kai, though wounded, threw himself between Eli and the alpha wolf, knocking the larger wolf aside with a force that sent it crashing into the wall. The two wolves locked in a deadly struggle, their teeth and claws flashing in the dim light. Eli's heart clenched as he watched. Kai was barely standing, but he was fighting with everything he had left. With a desperate cry, Eli reached for his rifle one last time. He aimed at the alpha, and with steady hands, fired. The shot rang out, hitting the alpha square in the head. The wolf crumpled to the ground, lifeless. But the danger wasn't over. The remaining wolves hesitated, their leader now gone, their pack broken. They slowly began to retreat, their eyes never leaving Eli and Kai as they backed out of the cabin, disappearing into the night. Kai stumbled, his body sagging from exhaustion and injury. Eli rushed to his side, his hands shaking as he gently touched the wolf's fur. "We made it," Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We survived." But even as the last wolf disappeared into the storm, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. He had learned a hard truth. Kai wasn't just a wolf. He was a symbol, a part of something far bigger than either of them had understood. Eli and Kai, bloodied and battered, stood together in the ruins of their fight. And for the first time, Eli understood what it meant to be part of something much larger than himself, a legacy, a bond, a fight for survival that stretched far beyond the wilderness. As the storm began to quiet, Eli whispered to the wolf by his side, "We're in this together." And in that moment, he knew, no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. Eli and Kai had faced the darkness together, surviving the storm and the pack's relentless pursuit. But in the end, they proved that courage and loyalty could overcome the greatest of challenges. Their bond was unbreakable, their journey just beginning. If this story inspired you, remember, no challenge is too great when you have trust and perseverance by your side. Subscribe for more stories of courage and hope, and share this video with someone who needs a little strength today.